The Primarchs are interesting characters for a lot of reasons, but my favorite one out of all of them would have to be Perturabo. And if I had to come up with one word to encapsulate him in its entirety, that word would be spite. Perturabo is almost entirely fueled by spite and angst. And more than just that, this is a whiny, stubborn, self-righteous man-child who, due to no fault of his own, was never once listened to or had the skills to properly articulate his wants and needs from others without resorting to extreme acts of violence. He is many things, but he is most of all human, and a truly tragic character who never once got his due from either the Emperor or his brother Primarchs. And unlike the other Primarchs that really struggled, like Lorgar, Mortarion, or even Magnus, the difference between Perturabo and them is those three complained. He didn't. He had a sheer strength of character and determination that just didn't exist, even amongst most of the Primarchs. And this sheer grinding will, combined with his character arc, is why I love him so much. Perturabo landed on the planet of Olympia, and unlike all of the other Primarchs, he instinctively knew his name was Perturabo, showing unlike his brothers, he had a better instinctive grasp on who he was than anybody else. After some mulling about, he was found by Damnatibus, leader of the city-state Locos on the planet, and adopted Perturabo as his son. You see, Olympia was very much so a Greco-Roman derived planet with a lack of a centralized planetary government, leading to many wars between the various city-states on the planet. And Perturabo, due to the fact that he was a Primarch, became Damnatibus' personal lapdog, sent to fight various governments and warlords to expand their territory, along with being shown to various lords and ladies on the planet because of how impressive Perturabo was. Look how cool Perturabo was. Look at this, he can build this cool thing. Isn't it great? La la la. Perturabo hated this with an unbridled passion because Perturabo doesn't like being shown off and hates war. He was not inspired by conflict, but by creation. He would rather sit in his room all day with schematics and blueprints, creating house projects or revitalizing the city infrastructure, than fight a needless war for his adoptive father. But something important to note is that Damnatibus genuinely loved and appreciated Perturabo. He did not see him as a tool, but as his actual son. And he wasn't just showing off his skills because it made him look good, which often did as a side effect, but because of the fact that he was proud of him. Not just for his capabilities, but who he was. And Perturabo never returned this kindness, because he thought his father viewed him as little more than a tool. And honestly, I don't blame him for having that impression, because Perturabo is incredibly smart. He is a glorified savant. He had an eidetic memory, he could learn things instantly, he was incredibly proactive and intelligent, but he thought his skills were valued, not who he was as a person. And the only person he thought actually valued him as a person was his stepsister Calliope, who he had quite a close relationship with and often acted as a grounding force for him. But despite all of these positive influences and good things that were trying to approach him, he would reject them and proceed to act out violently in an incredibly insolent manner, going as far as to go on rants and ravings, attacking and berating anyone and everyone that he disagreed with, especially the religious order of the planet, in an r/atheism level rantings that would make Mortarion blush, because in his mind, if he couldn't see it, it wasn't real, which is kind of funny because he would perpetually be able to see the Eye of Terror just out of the corner of his eye, no matter where he was in the galaxy, just staring him in the face, which is something he told next to no one. So I guess gods aren't real to him, but demon wormholes, those seem perfectly fine. This insufferable and insolent mindset would eventually quiet down into a bitter, angry, silent spite that would basically be the staple of his character going forward. And after the Emperor of Mankind made his presence known, his ideas about him having a higher purpose and there being no gods were immediately validated and submitted to the Emperor immediately, doing whatever he thought his true father would want him to do. But after meeting his legion, the Iron Warriors, and seeing their somewhat lackluster record, he proceeded to punish them in an extremely brutal fashion by doing something called decimation. What is decimation? Well, basically, he had the legion break into groups of 10. Each guy in that group of 10 would draw straws. The guy with the shortest straw would get beaten to death by the other 9. This would give him this reputation of being an incredibly cutthroat and brutal individual, putting him at odds with most of his brother Primarchs outside of Fulgrim, Horus, and Ferrus Manus. But it gets worse for him, as the Emperor would constantly stick him with odd jobs that no one else wanted, putting him right back into the place he was on Olympia, but instead of throwing temper tantrums, he would just grind his teeth, shut up, and do everything in his power to win. Even pulling victories out of thin air that should not have happened, he received no accolades. Not a thank you, not a good job, just an expectation of perfection and criticism everywhere else. Even if he did the exact thing he was told to do, he would still get shit for it. But there was another Primarch who was incredibly similar to Perturabo who did not get this treatment, that being Rogel Dorn. Primarch of the Imperial Fists, and a particular sore spot for Perturabo, as he would become incredibly jealous of Dorn's accomplishments, especially considering the fact that they would complete very similar tasks and one of them would get praised for it and the other would not. But the main reason why Dorn saw far more success is while both were incredibly stubborn bricks, Dorn was easier to work with half the time and wasn't constantly trying to justify his own existence. But the final nail in the coffin for Perturabo's relationship with Rogel Dorn was when Dorn got the job to build the Imperial Palace, while Perturabo and the Iron Warriors got sent to fight the Harad, a Xeno species so overpowered that they could control time and age things instantly. And this fight would be so bad that it would almost completely sour Perturabo's view of the Emperor entirely. And by this point, Perturabo was beyond pissed, but he got even more mad when he realized that Olympia began rebelling against the Imperium. And after failed negotiations, he began personally assaulting the planet with his legion. The climax of this event would result in him having a verbal spat with his stepsister, who after seeing what her stepbrother had become, decried him, calling him weak on the inside, and saying everything that he has ever said to himself 3 inches from the mirror. Enraged, he killed his sister and ordered what can be described as little more than a door-to-door exterminatus with millions dying on the planet, the rest of the population being used as slaves. This would be the point of no return for him, as this senseless act of violence gave him a sense of clarity that he never had. He was fearful of censure from the Emperor, rightfully so, because if Conrad Kurz couldn't get away from this crap, neither could he, and even though his legion followed his orders, they were highly disturbed by the actions of themselves and their Primarch, resulting in Perturabo crying, like genuinely crying, not like sexy crying with one tear, like, he actually genuinely cried. And he realized deep down that his sister was right, but in his mind, he could never come back from what he did and would have to accept his fate regardless of how he felt about it. And that is when Horus swooped in and took advantage of the situation, because by this point, Horus had been corrupted by chaos and was beginning to sow the web of the traitor legions that he needed for his coming war. And given how effective the Iron Warriors had been through most of the Great Crusade, the Iron Warriors were a pretty good option in Horus's mind, and seeing Perturabo's emotional vulnerability, decided to manipulate him by giving him the one thing he had never gotten: appreciation. He said that he did a good job, that what he did was tough and took guts, but by golly, he did a good job doing that door-to-door exterminatus business, and this would put him directly in Horus's pocket, and combined with his resentment towards the Emperor, he was perfectly fine with rallying to his side when the heresy would begin. During the lead-up to the Dropside Massacre, he would swindle some siege weapons from Lionel Johnson, something Lionel Johnson would sorely regret, as Perturabo was the one responsible for planning major parts of the Dropside Massacre, along with the Iron Warriors' artillery being the main reason why the Salamanders were completely annihilated and sat out most of the heresy. And that's the thing about the Horus heresy. Perturabo, potentially more than anyone else on the traitor side, really carried the war hard, and by the time the Siege of Terra rolled around, he was basically the only one left who had any sense of what was actually going on. And honestly, the heresy was kinda good for him. It allowed him to grow and mature as a person and realize a lot of things that he wasn't able to when he was under the Emperor's thumb. But continuing forward, Fulgrim approached Perturabo and said, "Hey, there's this thing called the Angel Exterminatus. We should go get it." Which in reality was little more than a ruse to allow Fulgrim to ascend to being the snake demon that he is today, and honestly he was kind of an ass about this the entire time, because he's Fulgrim and that's what he does. But there's one particular moment that I need to mention. You see, Perturabo liked modeling his battle plans with basically miniatures, like 40k miniatures. He had a massive table set up of like a battle plan with models and such of units in his army, which is honestly kind of funny to me, and he beckons Fulgrim over to look at his battle plan after a battle occurred where the Emperor's children, who by this point were completely lost in their sauce and were uncontrollable, abandoned the battle plan that they had planned, and this resulted in the deaths and failure of a push Perturabo wanted to make. And to teach Fulgrim a lesson, he proceeded to smash Fulgrim's face into a giant Titan miniature, breaking several of his teeth and basically saying, "You suck, your legion sucks, you're an asshole, and I am taking over this because you can't do anything right. Got it?" Fulgrim, after his face pummeling, naturally agrees, but after he tricks Perturabo and becomes a demon, just like I said before, this would result in Perturabo losing his health because, in the process of becoming a demon Primarch, Fulgrim sold Perturabo's soul, not only meaning that Perturabo lost his last actual friend, he was truly alone and very, very mad. And while the two were fighting, the Salamanders, Raven Guard, and Iron Hand showed up, with the conflict ending with an extremely bitter and wounded Perturabo contemplating his potential mortality for the first time, trying to find a way not to die, with little success. And after all of these events, the war is starting to come to a close as the Iron Warriors and the other traitor legions begin their massive push towards Terra, and Perturabo would be vital during these events, but just in a capacity that he didn't like, because instead of leading the push like he should have been, he was left to fortify certain areas to defend against the Ultramarines' potential arrival, which would begin the trend of Perturabo being screwed over by Horus now, with him getting constantly sidelined for everyone else, resulting in him getting even more pissed off than he already was. He also didn't like that the other legions were relying heavily on chaos corruption, and considering the fact that he thinks for all religion is cringe, he saw anyone giving themselves over to the ruinous powers as little more than just a useful moron, and this included Horus, who by this point was little more than a pawn for all 4 chaos gods by the time the siege ended. But due to the fact that he was basically just dying of old age as a Primarch, something that should have been impossible, he was strongly considering giving himself over to one of the gods or all 4 in an effort to save his life, something he was very disturbed he was considering, but felt like it was his only option because he didn't want to die. But the final straw for the siege came when Horus gave Mortarion command of his position at the siege. He just told him to do whatever, and Perturabo said, "Fuck it, I've had enough of you," would blow several holes in the Imperial Palace, and abandoned the siege, realizing it was a lost cause, and after he left, the entire traitor offensive on Terra completely collapsed, resulting in the Siege of Terra being lost. And this was the first real moment where Perturabo had any legs to stand on, and his character arc from going from a needy man-baby to a self-actualized spiteful brute was complete because of this action. But we're not done, because Rogel Dorn is still up and kicking, and if there's one thing Perturabo isn't above, it's giving Rogally Dogally a good shit kicking. Perturabo set up a fortress on the planet of Sebastus IV, and baited Rogel Dorn and the entire Imperial Fist Legion to come attack it. This would be an obvious trap, with 75% of the entire Imperial Fist Legion being lost during the battle. And honestly, Rogel would have died, along with the rest of the Imperial Fist, if it wasn't for Guilliman and the Ultramarine showing up, pushing back the Iron Warriors, but not before the Iron Warriors sacrificed 400 Imperial Fist Gene Seed to Chaos, allowing Perturabo to ascend to a Demon Prince, saving his life, although in a way I am certainly sure he did not like it all. And we haven't seen him since. I mean, he's apparently palling around with Vashtor the Archifane and loading soldiers and weapons to Abaddon, but past that, he's just been absent the last 10,000 years. And I hope that he comes back in some capacity, because I really want to see what he does. But Perturabo, out of every Warhammer character that I've read, has my favorite character arc, which says something since Warhammer has some incredibly well-written and fleshed out characters, but Perturabo is human in all aspects. He reacts like a person in his situation would. Someone who was raised and only valued for their talents in their mind won't grow up to be a pleasant person, but a bitter person driven by self-imposed servitude and spite. And I relate a lot to Perturabo. Not in all aspects, but enough to where I can really feel for the guy. He just wanted nothing more than a thank you. Not praise, not accolades, but appreciation. During his confrontation with his sister, she states that he's a hypocrite, and was so unaware of his surroundings that he spent so much time in his head spinning that he didn't consider his actions had any sort of consequences. She called him badly forged iron, stating that he had sulked his way to power, practiced indifference in place of modesty and awareness, and was totally unwilling to accept any sort of responsibility. As he would say that it wasn't his fault that he did what he did, hers was totally worse, but that doesn't excuse the fact that he still decimated his entire legion the first time he met them. He is just as guilty, and is a complete hypocrite, and he knows this. He completely knows this. And what's even worse is the fact that when given actual love, he dismissed it because they weren't like him. It's because they, quote, never understood him, when in reality, they did understand him. It was his brothers who didn't understand him. It was his own father who didn't understand him. But the one person that did was his stepdad, who turned out to be a pretty decent guy all around. Which makes it even more tragic, because in reality, Perturabo is no one to blame but himself. He spent so much time crying out in the dark while blinded by his own self-imposed superiority that it made it impossible for him to relate to anyone else even if he tried. And even worse is that he was valued. And honestly, when the Emperor would give him jobs, it was because the Emperor trusted him because he was really the only one qualified to do them. Except he just proceeded to try to do them in the hardest way possible. Not once did he consider any sort of flexibility or adaptivity, just throwing men into the meat grinder. Space Marines, Guardsmen, doesn't matter. And that only hurt his legion and his reputation. His pride prevented him from doing anything of substance, where others like Guilliman and Dorn, while incredibly stubborn, aren't pridefully stupid. Even Fulgrim and his massive ego aren't that naive. In essence, Perturabo is someone screaming from the shadows, brooding and crying for attention while never giving any indication that he wants it, blaming everyone else for his problems without realizing the greatest lesson in life is to realize you can only fix things for you, and nobody else will care if you don't speak up and communicate. He didn't need to be a hammer. He didn't have to do any of the things he did during the Crusade to get recognition, because he never seemed like he wanted it in the first place. He's just as much to blame for his issues as anyone else, And that is why I love him. I love him because he falls. He fails. He starts at the bottom, and then achieves a sense of identity when out on his own. And when finally faced with his own mortality because of Fulgrim's actions, he fully comes into his own and becomes a three-dimensional character. Thank you all very much for watching. And if you would like to learn a little bit more about Perturabo, and I have a few reading recommendations. Angel Exterminatus was Perturabo's first real character-driven novel, and it was honestly quite good. Perturabo, the Hammer of Olympia, is one of the Primarchs books, and it's honestly really quite good. Slaves to Darkness is also really, really good, and almost all of the Siege of Terra novels have him show up somewhere, but the two I'd recommend are The First Wall and Mortis. Thank you very much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed the video. If you'd like to support the channel, please consider becoming a member. And thank you very much for the YouTube channel members. Your support means the world to me. Thank you all very much for watching. Have a great night.